All of my content is also posted on 5colorcombo.com, a great website for all of your Magic the Gathering needs, including articles, podcasts, and custom Magic the Gathering tokens and playmats. As a subscriber to my channel, you can use the discount code NEEDSAHONE5 for a 5% discount in their store. You can find the link in the description below. Hello everyone, I am NEEDSAHONE, and it is time for another MTG Top 10. Each and every week I bring you guys a new MTG-related Top 10 list on every Friday. This week is the second part of a two-part series of Top 10s where I go back and look at what I predicted about Kaladesh in my limited review before I had a chance to play any of the format, and see what I got wrong as a way of giving you guys a more updated record of my thoughts on the format. Obviously, evaluating cards in a vacuum is never perfect, so going back and discussing my biggest mistakes once I've actually played the format is a pretty fruitful exercise for me in helping me improve in my future card evaluation, and it hopefully will help for you as well. Last week I looked at the top 10 cards I underrated, and this week we're looking at the ones I overrated. For each card in the list, I will discuss how I initially thought about the card, how I now think about the card, and what led me to misevaluating each of them. Let's get started. At number 10, I have Herald of the Fair. Herald of the Fair isn't a card I mentioned in any of my best commons or uncommons videos, and I certainly never thought it was one of those, but I did mention it in my archetype guide where I mentioned that it seems like it is a solid 3-mana 3/2 with upside who can be okay with blink effects or to push through extra damage. It turns out Herald of the Fair granting only +1/+1 isn't really that big of an effect in this format that has tons of creatures with high toughness coming down as early as turn 3 or 4. The card reminded me a bit of Yiva's Force Mage from Magic Origins, and I think that's what caused me to misevaluate it. But the big difference for these two cards is the format they existed in. Magic Origins was a format loaded with lots of 2-drops and guys with prowess. Pushing guys with prowess through was a really powerful thing to do, and in general that format was much more aggressive. In addition to that, +2/+2 is just way more than +1/+1. As I noted in last week's video, I didn't do a great job of properly evaluating blue cards in my limited review, and that theme continues with this list, with Vedalken Blademaster being the first example of that. Oftentimes, thinking about how cards from past limited formats have played is a good way of helping you evaluate cards, at least in the early going, and this card, while it seemed like a strictly worse version of Ingenious Skaab, the Skaab was perhaps the best blue common in Eldritch Moon, and that still seemed like it would be a pretty good card to me to have a strictly worse Skaab. The problem is that this format just doesn't have a ton of instants and sorceries that are worth playing, that allow you to realistically threaten activation of its prowess trigger, and unlike in Shadows and Eldritch Moon, there's no blue-red spells archetype. More frequently, when you have the Blademaster in play, you do something like play an artifact or a malfunction or something, and make it a 3/4, which maybe lets you attack more effectively, but on a lot of board states, that is still easy to double block, in addition to the fact that you can't pump him surprisingly very often. I do think there is probably a narrow case of an aggressive blue-red or blue-white deck that is focused on artifacts, and as a result is running multiple built-to-smashes or built-to-lasts, where this card can produce the type of blowouts we are used to with prowess, but I haven't played against or drafted that deck yet. And my mistakes in blue continue with Windrake. This one pains me the most since I have played a lot of Windrakes in my day, and they have almost always been a solid playable. Not in this set though. The format has two frequently playable cards with reach, Consulate Skygate and Highspire Artisan, that just make Windrake look silly. If you look outside of the commons, there are several other flyers that quickly outclass the Windrake, like Aerial Responder. On top of that, it is not always easy to get an aggressive blue deck going, and that is the shell that's probably best for Windrake. Frequently, if I have a Windrake, it ends up getting in for maybe 2, and then getting stonewalled by a bigger flyer or a creature with reach. I have found myself cutting Windrakes more and more as the format has gone on, and that makes me a little sad because I always love playing Windrakes, but not so much in this format. Like Herald of the Fair, I thought that number 7, Lawless Broker, was another 3-mana 3/2 with some upside, especially in a format that cares about +1/+1 counters, but it turns out there are just better things to do in this format for 3 mana or even less at common. Just to talk about black cards that cost 3 or less, I'd rather spend turn 3 casting a Foundries creature, a Doomed Operative, or a Weaponcraft Enthusiast. And if you move out of black, there are tons of other 3-drops I'd rather be playing, like Glint Sleeve Artisan or Highspire Artisan. This card would be considerably better if it had the death trigger of Fabricate 1, but as it is, I find myself cutting this card more often than I play it, even in a deck that's heavy in +1/+1 counters. And that's partly because if Lawless Broker is your only creature, you don't get to put the counter on anything and it sort of gets lost, and that's not great. But I find myself cutting it despite the +1/+1 counter theme more often than I play it. I screwed up on vehicles pretty hard in general, given that this is the first time we ever saw them. They were admittedly difficult to evaluate. And so I have 2 vehicles at number 6 here. The one thing I did get right is that Renegade Freighter is an incredible common, certainly the best common vehicle and one of the best commons in the format. But apart from that, I think I overvalued the Bazaar Barge and Ballista Charger, and as we saw in last week's video, I underrated Sky Skiff. I saw Bazaar Barge and Ballista Charger as solid playables because of the extra value they bring. The Bazaar Barge always draws you a card, the Charger can pick off a creature or do 1 more damage to something, but it turns out Crew 3 is just a ton, and in a lot of decks you don't want to be spending a turn to cast these things and then have to tap down some of your creatures to swing with the vehicle. While I think both are certainly playable, I think the majority of the time they are better in your sideboard, though if you have a creature-based deck that's sort of more mid-ranged, they do get a lot better, but in a straight-up aggro deck, you don't even want these. At number 5, I have Naram Cobra. I always love creatures with Death Touch since they give the ability to trade with anything, giving you some pretty nice advantage when it does something like trade for a 6-drop. The problem is this format is filled to the brim with 1/1 tokens, mostly servos, and since 3 colors are really heavy in the Fabricate mechanic. Against decks that play a lot of servos, Naram Cobra is pretty bad. You can still block well with it, but if they're just attacking into you with servos, you still can't even do that. And against those decks, Naram Cobra should often be sided out. Against decks with no servos or a few servos, he is as good as I expected him to be, and I think in some cases he is just best to start in your sideboard because of the huge swing in the card, depending on your matchup. The other thing to note is there are not too many, but there are several common green cards with Trample, like Pima Outrider and Riparian Tiger, and then make this guy worse too because you're like, okay, I guess I can trade with it, but I'm still taking 5, which sometimes you just can't afford to take, and that makes it a little worse as well. Alright, now we're starting to get into my more egregious mistakes. The rest of the cards on this list I wasn't wildly wrong about. They were just sort of cards I thought were decent playables or something of that sort, and then turned out to either not be very playable or just worse than I thought they would be. But the top 4 cards on this list are all things that I overrated by a lot. And the first of these is Longfin Sky Whale, also the final example of how much I screwed up on blue here. Generally, a 4 mana for a 4/3 flyer with the downside of being unable to block is a really good card in almost any format. But what a card like this needs is an aggressive deck. The problem is aggressive blue decks in this format are all but non-existent. Generally, blue is a color that can make the game last for a long time and then win with flyers or something, and the Sky Whale can provide the latter part, but the downside of not being able to block is very real in a format loaded with Pima Outriders and Renegade Freighters at common rarity who can just smash into your face if your 4/3 can't actually block them. I've had the Sky Whale be good for me, don't get me wrong, generally in a more aggressively curved Blue-White Skies deck that has a lot of good removal, but this is a narrow case, not something you can always end up in, and I think this card isn't more than a solid 4-drop in most blue decks, and there is absolutely no way I take this card over the uncommons I said I would take the Longfin Sky Whale over originally, and those are Glint Nest Crane or Ether Meltdown. Instead, I would say, I even said Longfin Sky Whale was first pickable, as you can see, and I completely disagree with myself now, having played the format and having the whale result in some bad beats for me because it couldn't block. Again, it is still a solid card. Just don't first pick it. If you're in blue and you see one like in the middle of a pack, by all means take it and it'll be a solid card, but don't first pick it. Don't listen to what I said in the limited review initially. The theme of the top 3 cards in this list is that I overrated removal that can kill small creatures. In most formats, a card like Furious Reprisal would be a frequent 2-for-1, making it worth it to spend turn 4 casting this clunky spell because of the card advantage you would get off of it. Instead, I find myself more frequently using this to maybe kill 1 creature and do 2 to an opponent, or killing a real creature and a servo token, neither of which feels great for sorcery speed at 4 mana. I, of course, always had this card behind Harness Lightning, which is, of course, the best red uncommon, but I think it's also behind Malphis, Doorbuster, and Brazen Scourge for most red-based decks as well, because most of those decks are really aggressive, and they don't want to be spending 4 mana to cast Furious Reprisal. They'd rather just play something like Malphis, Doorbuster, which has the effect of making something unable to block, which is a real effect. Most red decks are aggressive, and this hurts the card in general, so that's the reason. While I still think it's a solid card, again, it's sort of like Longfin Sky Whale. If I had one of these in basically every red deck, I would be pretty happy, but I do not want to be spending an early pick on it in most cases when there's going to be almost definitely something better in the pack. At number 2, I have Chandra's Pyro Helix, and when I saw this card and realized it was a functional reprint of one of the best commons from Dragons of Tarkir, Twin Bolt, I figured Chandra's Pyro Helix would perform similarly, but it doesn't. Twin Bolt excelled because there were lots of X2s in that format, and even a tons of X1s. It could allow you to get 2-for-1s enough to make first picking the card worth it. This format doesn't have a whole lot of that. Probably because of the presence of servos, Wizards seem to avoid giving too many creatures only 1 toughness in this format, certainly the ones on the ground. So 2-for-1s with this thing aren't all that common, and more often than not, the card is more of a reality hemorrhage that is just 1 and a red to do 2 damage to something than it is a Twin Bolt. This isn't to say it isn't still a strong common. It is, and I probably want at least 1 and maybe even 2 in every red deck I build, but I would not first pick this in most cases, as it is outshined by many other cards. The only reason it doesn't drop below being the second best red common is only because red is pretty shallow when it comes to commons in this set. Finally, at number 1, I have Dyoung, another card that I overrated based on the fact that it looked like a premium removal spell because it could kill a creature for a decent rate, but I think I was wrong. I said this was the best black common and a great first pick, sort of similar to what I did with the Pyro Helix, where in reality, it is a solid card, but first picking it is not usually going to be very wise, and this is because you're not sure you're going to end up with a lot of ways to make energy, and a lot of the times it's just going to be 2 mana, give -2/-2 to something. By all means, though, if your first pack you're in black and you've picked up, like, Thriving Rats and other ways of making energy, Dyoung does get considerably better. I'm only saying in the very early portion of the draft, I don't like first picking this card anymore because it's a clunky 2 mana removal spell that will usually only kill another 2 mana creature for you, so you're sort of only finishing at parity, and that's not the greatest place to be. All right, well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. I hope this series of 2 videos where I talked about things I overrated and underrated will help you in your future Kaladesh limited endeavors. If you want to post anything in the comments, like cards that you think, other cards maybe I overrated, or cards you think I'm being hard on myself about here that maybe you think I'm now underrating, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. And if you want to make sure you catch an MTG Top 10 as well as a lot of other Magic the Gathering content each and every week, don't forget to click subscribe. Thanks for watching.